Hi, I want to do something a little different today. No attack reconstructions, no forensic timelines, no conflicting accounts of something that may or may not have been a wolf. Today, I'm going to read to you, and specifically, I'm going to read the first chapter of my Bigfoot novel, Rogue. And between sections, I'll pull back the curtain a little on the references, the craft decisions I made, and a couple of things buried in the text that some of you might or probably have already spotted. Because this chapter, as it turns out, has quite a lot going on underneath it. If you've been here from the start, you might remember I kicked off the channel in much the same way, with a reading from the first chapter of Shadow Beast. That felt like the right way to introduce what the channel was about. Fiction and fact sitting alongside each other. This feels like the right moment to do it again. So, find somewhere comfortable. But before we begin, I want to flag something before we get into the chapter itself, because it's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. The chapter itself is called Bigfoot and Henriksons. Now, if you know your Bigfoot cinema, and I expect some of you do almost as well as I do, that title will land immediately. Harry and the Hendersons, or Bigfoot and the Hendersons, it was known here in the UK, came out in 1987, starring John Lithgow, Melinda Dillon, Margaret Langrick and Joshua Rudoy. It's a family comedy about a Bigfoot accidentally adopted by a suburban Seattle family. And it's a film I have genuine affection for. It's warm, it's funny, and underneath the comedy, there's actually something quite thoughtful about how we respond to something we can't categorise. But the homage doesn't stop at the title. Every member of the Henriksen family in the book chapter, John, Melinda, Maggie and Josh, are named after the actor who played their equivalent character in the film. So, John Lithgow, Melinda Dillon, Margaret Langrick and Joshua Rudoy, as I said. Which means the chapter is doing two things at once. It's a family in genuine peril, and it's also a quiet love letter to a film that shaped how a lot of people first thought about this subject, or even got into it. And then there's the chapter title itself, Bigfoot and Henriksons. The name Henriksen, that's not just a nod to the film. Lance Henriksen has appeared in more Bigfoot horror films than almost any other actor working today. Abominable, Big Legend, Sasquatch Mountain, and that's just to mention a few. If you spent any time in this corner of the genre, and I have, you'll know his face well. He's become something of a totemic figure in it, and the name felt like the right way to acknowledge that. So, 3 layers of reference sitting inside just a chapter title. Let's get into it. John Henriksen glanced in the rearview mirror. His teenage daughter Maggie was staring out the window with the same look of frustrated boredom she had worn since they'd left the house 9 hours ago. The expensive headphones covering her ears prevented intrusion from the deep and otherwise penetrating snores coming from her younger brother Josh, slumped in the seat next to her. John let out a sigh as he looked across to Melinda, his wife. She was fixing him with a stare that warned her own tolerance of the journey was dangerously close to collapsing. Maybe we're a little too early in the season, he offered apologetically. You think, Melinda replied, a little short, but as good-naturedly as she could manage. If the next one is shut too, we'll just stop at a motel in the next town. We don't have to camp. And you'll cover the extra $60 a day we'll have to budget for, she scolded. He half smiled at her, thinking it would be a small price to pay compared to the nagging and told you so attitude he'd have to put up with otherwise. And the thought of a warm, comfortable double bed certainly had more allure than the camping cots, which were stowed away in the trunk. So far, they'd been to 4 camping grounds, only to find thick chains across the entrances of each. He fixed his eyes on the road, guiding what had been his father's 1987 Ford County Squire station wagon through the sweeping curves of the scenic forest setting of North Washington State. Towering pines, sequoia and oak rose in steep banks on either side, the road climbing the mountain in natural undulations and tight corners. The car leaned and wallowed in these, showing its age with tremors along the chassis and groans from the suspension. Even the cars had enough, Melinda said, rolling her eyes. As they rounded the next bend, John spotted the damaged sign out of the corner of his eye. He couldn't make out the first part, but the word campsite was still readable. He had to stamp on the brakes to avoid shooting past, but he wasn't too worried, having not seen a car in the rearview mirror for hours. Both Melinda and Maggie glared at him, but they weren't ready to escalate into all-out argument yet. He stared out of the window at the track that led into the darkness beneath the trees. It was heavily overgrown, but something in the pit of his stomach was telling him it was worth exploring. He turned the wheel and pushed the car over the grass verge. The suspension bucked and protested along the deeply rutted trail, but after a slight rise, it was all downhill, and he coasted the car down to the campground. The first spring flowers had already begun to push themselves through the knotted mass of overgrown grass. Red columbine, bearberry, and great camas dotted the meadow. Surrounding it were clumps of fireweed, and beyond them were the trees. By the close clumping of the trunks, John guessed it had once all been Forest Service land. He turned off the engine and looked back at Melinda, who didn't seem quite so enamoured. "You're not serious, are you?" she exclaimed. "What's wrong? It looks great," he replied, offended. "It looks deserted," she snapped back. "What about toilets?" "We've got tissue and wipes. Back to nature, baby," he replied, smiling smugly. "I thought it was only bears who shit in the woods," she said shrewdly. John checked his phone. He had one bar of signal, and he tapped on the GPS app he'd installed. "I'll stop there for a second. Did you notice the plants? Red columbine, bearberry, great camas, fireweed. They're not there just for window dressing. Every species named in that wet meadow is native to the North Pacific Northwest, specifically to the kind of transitional zone you'll find at the lower slopes of Mount Rainier in early spring. I do this throughout the book and in my other books. The flora and fauna are real, and they're chosen carefully because they do something the writing can't do explicitly. They root you in a specific place, in a specific season, normally set within a specific ecological moment. If I'd written wild flowers and tall trees, you could be anywhere. But red columbine and bearberry in a recovering meadow surrounded by close planted forest, that's Washington State. That's the Pacific Northwest. Your brain starts building a picture before I've told it to. There's a Lewis's woodpecker coming up in the next section, and it's the same principle. It's a real species native to the region, and it behaves in a specific way, flicking its tail, watching from height. It's a detail that costs nothing but earns a great deal in terms of atmosphere and authenticity. The other thing I want to flag here is what Melinda says. "I thought it was only bears who shit in the woods." It's a joke, but it's also doing something else. It plants that idea of bears in your mind, of being in the Pacific Northwest wilderness. It makes you feel like the obvious candidate for anything that might go wrong, which it is. And of course, that's what John is going to assume later. It's misdirection, but the natural kind. The kind that comes from how people actually think, not from just me, the author, shoving you towards a false conclusion. So, let's continue. It took a while to load the app, but eventually the screen became populated with green and white squares and a yellow roadway that led to the north. The area known as Paradise on the southern slopes of Mount Rainier was a little over 3 miles away. "How about a compromise?" he suggested. "I'm listening," Melinda shrugged. We camp here, but we head to Paradise for dinner at the inn. Means we don't have to do anything but set up the tents. And if it's not working out, we move on tomorrow. But for now, we get out of the car, get the tents up before dark, and don't have to cook. Sold, Maggie interjected from behind. Melinda rolled her eyes, but couldn't quite hide her smile. John woke up Josh, who was more taken with the campsite they had to themselves. John watched as the 12-year-old boy busied himself with getting the tents from the trunk and putting them up. There were 2 modern dome tents for his parents and his sister, and his own backpacking bivouac and cover, which offered slightly more basic shelter. As soon as he'd finished one of the dome tents, he offered it to his sister, who hadn't budged from the car. She grabbed her bag and flung it into the empty space beyond the door flap. Josh grinned as he bolted back to the car for one of the camp beds. He passed it to Maggie as he sped past, ready to get going on his parents' tent. John stopped him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You set yourself up. Me and Mum will do ours. Mine won't take a minute, though, Josh offered. That gives you more time to explore, John offered back. It certainly looks and smells like uncharted territory, Maggie called from inside her tent. Josh had his tent set up within a few minutes, with just a roll mat and his sleeping bag pushed inside. A clear strip of plastic, which would be by his head when inside, would give him a brilliant view of the stars and any wildlife that wandered through into the camp. He'd seen deer, turkey, and even a black bear once. There was just enough space in the entrance for his backpack to sit upright. He left it there and returned to the car to grab his hiking boots. I want to pause here because what follows is the chapter's first real turn, and it's built on something that comes up again and again in eyewitness accounts. But first, let's talk about that woodpecker. Josh heads into the trees. He spots a Lewis's head woodpecker above him, flicking its tail, watching from a high bough. He notices it because of its size and because of the silhouette it makes in a low light between the trunks. It's a small moment, but it's doing something very specific. It tells you Josh is observant. He knows what he's looking at. He knows what belongs in these woods. And that matters because what comes next depends on you trusting his perception. So, with all of that in mind, let's keep going. He headed straight for the far tree line. It was cool and dark between their branches, and he knew he wouldn't have to go too much higher before he would find snow clinging to the frozen ground. He did his coat up and stood for a moment. He noticed a Lewis's woodpecker flicking its tail and watching him through a bough high above. In the close grouping of the trees, it and everything else was in silhouette, but its size gave it away. There was no real path to guide him, so Josh decided to make his own. He intended to circle the campsite in a wide arc, not straying too far, but getting a good idea of the surroundings at least. Straight through the maze of trunks, about 100 feet ahead of him, he could see a large, wide stump. Beyond that, the trees seemed to close in, and he couldn't see much further. He decided to head towards the stump and use it as a marker to turn south, back towards the far border of the camp. He picked his way through the towering trunks, occasionally having to pull branches out of his way or duck to avoid thicker protruding limbs. He had gone about 30 feet when something made him stop. The dripping meltwater, the call of crows, even the sound of his boots digging into the dirt and slime had filled his ears until that moment. But it had all been replaced with unnerving silence. He'd been keeping his gaze trained on the ground as he picked his path, but now he looked up sharply on alert. Nothing. He squinted in the low light at the stump. For a second there, he thought he'd seen something, a glint of reflected light. Only now did he realise how big it was, at least 6 feet high and nearly 4 feet across. It piqued his interest, making him wonder what species of tree it could be. He looked down as he lifted his foot over a low torn branch that lay across the ground. Immediately, there was a sharp, savage-sounding grunt from up ahead. Josh froze, this time in fear. His eyes slowly rose, once more seeking out the stump. Nothing had changed, but the remnants of an icy breath of water vapour clung to the air in front of it. Josh shuddered as he realised his own laboured breathing was creating similar clouds of mist. Just then, he heard his mum calling in the distance. He turned instinctively to look. The movement he caught in the corner of his eye stopped him, and his head snapped back to the stump one more time. It wasn't there anymore. That was as much as he could take, and he broke into a run, crashing back through the trees in a straight line towards the safety of the camp. As he burst back out into the sunlight, a rock the size of a softball flew past his head and smacked into the side of his hammock. He came to a stop and stood, trembling for a moment, unsure if he should turn around. When he did, the ominous feeling he'd felt among the trees had vanished. Birdsong had returned, and the sounds of his family laughing and going about camp business filled his ears. He went to join them. Let me stop there for a second again, and let's talk about the stump. I want to talk about that because it's one of the most consistent motifs in the Sasquatch eyewitness accounts, and I don't think it's an accident. Across dozens of reports, witnesses describe the same sequence. They see what they take to be a tree stump. Old growth, 6 feet or more, wide, dark and motionless. And then it moves, or it's simply gone, vanishing without sound and no warning. If you read or look at enough Bigfoot reports, this is a familiar scenario. A witness hiking in the Pacific Northwest in the late afternoon, clear visibility, they're normally confident in their surroundings. They stop to look at what they are certain is a stump, normally noting its unusual height, the density of it, and in the time it takes them to look down at their footing or look back up, it's not there. The stump was never a stump. Now, why does this happen so consistently? Part of it is light. The forest at dusk or in overcast conditions has a way of flattening depth. Something large and dark and motionless at a distance really can read as a fixed object. The visual information your brain or any of our brains receives generally supports that interpretation. But the other part, and this is where it gets interesting, is what Sasquatch researchers call the freeze response. The idea that this animal, when it realises it's been spotted, doesn't bolt, it holds, it becomes part of the background, and it's extraordinarily good at it. Whether you believe in the animal or not, that behaviour, which other animals, even including elephants, exhibit, is deeply unsettling, because it implies calculation, patience, and a decision. That's exactly what I wanted Josh to feel in this moment. Not a jump scare, something slower, the gradual, horrible realisation that what he'd assumed was fixed wasn't. The rock throw at the end of the sequence is also drawn directly from documented reports. Rock throwing is one of the most commonly described forms of Sasquatch territorial behaviour. Many speak about how they felt they could hit very precise targets if need be, and only miss taking out human heads deliberately, but not by much. Enough to make anyone think very carefully about retreat. It's likely warning behaviour, but it could easily also be something more aggressive. Either way, Josh knows something happened. He just doesn't know what. And that ambiguity to me is far more unsettling than showing you the thing directly. So let's get into the second half. Despite being quiet and back from his exploration of the forest a little earlier than expected, John put Josh's edginess down to being tired from the journey. He chucked checked in on him with an occasional glance in the rearview mirror as they headed to dinner at the Paradise Inn. The boy stared out of the window, his brow wrinkled and his eyes darting to the trees with a nervous energy and intensity that seemed unusual. John decided to try and talk to him when they were back, after a good meal. After all, the quickest route to the heart was through the stomach. By the time they had piled into the Paradise Inn's dining room, good spirits overtook them all, and Josh's disposition became solely focused on the long, generously plated buffet table. John and Melinda also ordered some extra entrees from the menu as a reward for the long journey and a possible cold night ahead. John felt much more reassured that things were going well and they would soon be settled at the campsite. Despite its relatively rustic amenities, they'd all cope, even Maggie. They'd soon get into the spirit of things. By the time dessert came around, he had completely forgotten about trying to talk to Josh. He tipped the waiter extra for an unopened bottle of red wine to be subtly delivered to the table, which he slipped into his jacket for later. Melinda would appreciate seeing in the holiday with style, and with the kids in their own tents for the first time, who knew what else she might be in the mood for? It had been a while. No reason, other than busy, tired lives, he thought. But that's what vacations were for. They were still laughing and roughhousing as they made their way back to the car. The night had crept up on them, and John checked his watch. It was a little after 9. They'd been out longer than he thought, but that was okay. He was glad they'd set the tents up and had nothing left to do but climb into their cots when they got back. He'd start a fire, though, just to be sure and safe. The Washington woods at night harboured more than just trees. And after all, he liked the firelight too. The warmth, the glow. It felt good to sit around a fire and take it all in. John went slow on the road back, wary of deer that might dash across as he passed. He always wondered why they did that, wait till the last moment. They always waited until you were right on top of them, testing your reflexes and heart condition at the same time. In the dark, it was even more difficult to spot the entrance to the campsite. As before, he had to stamp on the brakes to avoid shooting past. He pulled the car around and onto the track. He was more confident this time, and the car bucked and strained even more than the first time. The kids laughed it off as Melinda rolled her eyes, smiling contentedly. As John applied the brakes sharply a second time, bringing them to an abrupt halt, the smiles and laughter vanished. "What the hell?" John stammered, peering over the steering wheel through the windshield. Melinda followed his gaze. She felt the piercing looks of the children behind her. It was as if a tornado had been through the meadow. Maggie's tent to the far right had been torn in half, revealing a mash of poles and mangled nylon. The contents of her bag were strewn around the meadow. It was the same for the others too. One of the camping cots, impossible to tell whose, had been bent and crumpled into a ball like paper mache, then deposited into the boughs of an oak some 20 feet up. Josh's tent had been reduced to shreds. The split and ruined frame poked out of the ground where the rest of it had been hammered into the earth. But it was John and Melinda's tent that drew their attention. 4 long slashes had been clawed along the side that faced them. They sat in silence for what seemed minutes. Then John opened the door and stepped out of the car. It hadn't rained, but a dank smell hit his nostrils, a putrid mix of musk and urine. The headlights were the only source of light and offered 2 thin corridors of illumination, stretching from the car to the trees at the back of the meadow. John took a few steps forward, each one revealing more of the possessions ransacked, destroyed, and distributed across the open ground. A cooler hung from a tree. Beer cans that had been ripped apart littered the floor below. A trail of Cheetos led into the grass and abruptly stopped. Blue polystyrene trays were all that remained of their meat stash. Hamburgers, steaks, sausage and bacon had all been stripped from their packages and presumably devoured. John guessed a bear had found the campsite and taken advantage of their absence. He was surprised it had managed to get the coolers and storage containers open, which were meant to be tamper-proof. As he took another step forward onto the torn remains of a sleeping bag, he flinched at the sound of a heavy impact somewhere in front of him. Whatever had made the noise was beyond the reach of the headlights, but he still peered into the gloom. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a dark shape take form. It was like a void in the shadows, blacker than the night surrounding it. Then it was gone. He turned as he heard Melinda approaching from behind. "What do you think happened?" she asked. It must have been a bear," John replied, turning back to the scene of destruction. "I want to get out of here," Maggie whined, leaning over the open car door and gripping its frame intensely. Melinda's frightened and alert eyes told John she felt the same way. "Why don't you guys get back in the car? I'll see if there's anything worth salvaging," he suggested. "Something just doesn't feel right," Melinda said, her eyes scanning the darkness as she began to back up. John looked towards the car, intending to call Josh over to help him. But the boy was still as a statue, sat in the car with his seatbelt fastened. He had twisted his head around to look through the window towards the nearest grouping of trees. Something there held his attention. John slowly turned his head in the same direction. He could see nothing. The haze from the headlights dulled his vision and made the shadows blur into swirling shapes that disappeared into the vortex. He was about to look away again when a low, guttural grunt emanated from the trees. The sound hit him in the chest like a punch. As he flinched instinctively at the noise, he felt his stomach spasm in readiness to dispel his dinner. Melinda was looking at him in terror, her head snapping back and forth between John and the darkness. "Get in the car," John ordered. She was about to protest when a rock appeared out of the gloom. About the size of a cantaloupe, Melinda had just enough time to duck back into the car before it would have smashed into her head. Then John saw there was definitely something there in the gloom. It crossed the track behind the car in a single, fleeting rush of movement. Now there was nothing between it and John. It had purposely moved around the car to get past the obstruction. John only had to contemplate its possible intentions for a moment before he was running full tilt towards the open driver's door. He grabbed at the keys in his panic to get the engine started, stamping on the gas and throwing it into reverse as it roared into life. The elderly Windsor V8 screamed at the abuse as he yanked the steering wheel round. The car pirouetted for a slash of mud and debris, scattering it across the trail in an untidy arc. John shifted into drive and felt the back end shudder as the rear tyres fought for grip. For a second, they were immobile before the big car catapulted forwards, bouncing precariously along the track. Just before he swerved back onto the asphalt of the main road, the rear window shattered as a spruce limb jettisoned into the car's interior. Neither Maggie's nor Melinda's screams were enough to make him stop or even look back. And that's chapter 1. I want to talk just briefly about the thing the chapter never does. It never shows you the animal, not clearly, not once. You obviously get the stump that moves. There's the void in the shadows, black of the night around it, which, again, many eyewitnesses report. A shape that crosses the track in a single fleeting rush. And that spruce limb through the rear window. That's it. For me, it felt like the right choice. Not just for this chapter, but for this kind of writing in general. The moment you fully describe the thing, especially early on, you set a ceiling on the fear because what I can describe will always be smaller than what you can imagine. Your version of what's standing just outside the headlights is almost certainly more unsettling than anything I could put into words. So I don't try. I let you scare yourselves. But what I do try to do instead is establish very early what the creature is capable of. A camping cot bent and crumpled into a ball, deposited 20 feet up in an oak tree. Those 4 slashing claw marks along a tent wall. And a rock the size of a melon thrown with accuracy in the dark. This thing is not friendly, and it's strong in a way that changes the register of everything that follows. And that felt important to establish in chapter 1, before you've even seen the thing, before the family has any idea with what they're dealing with. Because once you know what it can do, the fear of what it might do becomes something that you, the reader, will carry forward. At least I hope so. And then there's that final moment. It crosses the track, it moved around the car deliberately. Not instinct, not in panic, with purpose. That's the note I wanted to end the chapter on. There are more Easter eggs coming. Chapter 2 has a few, including one that some of you in this community will find very satisfying. But I'll save that for another time. Rogue is available now on Amazon and Audible, and there's a link in the description as always. I just want to say again, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. Please subscribe and like the video if you indeed did enjoy it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again very soon.